everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I have a mega video where I'm sharing 25 of my favorite farmhouse DIYs. Since this is a combination of a lot of my videos put together, just keep in mind that the projects are labeled a little bit out of order. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. Now let's go ahead and get right into it. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be using 4 of these 4x6 canvases from Dollar Tree, and I'm going to be removing all of the canvases from their frames. To do that, I'm using my utility knife, and I'm running the knife along the outside edges of my frame, and I'm doing that on the outside of where the staples are. Once I have it cut, I'm then just removing the canvas, and then any of the canvas that is still underneath the staples, I'm just ripping that right off of the back side of the frame. Now that I have all of my canvas removed, I'm painting all 4 of my wood frames with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I only had to do 1 coat of paint for all of the frames, and I did make sure to paint the inside of the frames as well because you will be able to see them. Once the plaster color was all dry, I then used my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle on a Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I very lightly painted this color over top of the frames to give them a farmhouse, a rustic look. And again, I just continued that same step for all 4 frames. Now it's time to attach all of my frames. To do this, I am using hot glue. I placed hot glue on one side of one of my frames to attach it to another one of the frames to make one section, and then I did the same thing for the bottom 2 frames. I just hot glued them together on the sides to make a second section, and then I hot glued the 2 sections together to make one piece. For this project, I thought it would be really cute to add some chicken wire to the backs of my frame. So here I'm taking this chicken wire that I picked up from Joann Fabrics a really long time ago. I'm not sure if they still sell it, but I am just cutting it down to size to go on the back of my frame, and I used just some cutters that I have from Dollar Tree to do that. And then I'm taking the strip of chicken wire that I just cut and I'm stretching it out a little bit so that it will fit a little bit better on the back of my frame, and then I'm using my staple gun to staple it along the back of the frame. I did those same steps for the remaining 3 frames. I thought by working in sections with the chicken wire, it was just a little bit easier to work with. If you can't find the roll of wire at Joann Fabrics like this one, I do know that hardware stores like Lowe's and Home Depot do sell it. Once I had all of my wire attached, I'm then adding this windmill that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. I did get it after Christmas time. It was on clearance, and I'm just cutting off the hanger that came on the ornament, and then to attach it to the center of my frame, I'm using hot glue around the inside circle and just pressing that down in the center of the frames. And this is the framed windmill piece all finished. I think it turned out super cute and it was really affordable to create. If you wanted to, you could put a hanger on the back of it and hang it on the wall, or just set it on a table like I did here. Now moving into DIY number 2. For this project, I'm using one of these unfinished mini wooden candlesticks. This piece did come from Hobby Lobby and it came in a pack of, I believe, 4 of them. I'm starting by painting this piece with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did only do 1 coat of paint on this. For this project, I'm also using this mini galvanized watering can. I did just recently pick it up at Hobby Lobby and it was on clearance for 74 cents. It had a stem on the bottom of it that I just wiggled a little bit to pop that off. Once that was off, I then used hot glue on the top of my candlestick and then attached it right in the center of the bottom of my watering can. I then added some Spanish moss from Dollar Tree inside of the watering can, and I'm also using some of these mini succulents from Michael's, and I'm using 3 of them for this project. I put hot glue on the bottom of each succulent and then placed it inside of the Spanish moss. Once I had all of the succulents inside of the can, I ended up adding some more Spanish moss around all of the succulents, and to do that, again, I just used hot glue on the Spanish moss and then stuck that around each succulent. For the last step in this project, I did end up adding a little bit of distressing to the bottom of the candlestick, and I used the folk art chalk paint in the color Castle to do that. This is my Pedestal watering can planter all finished. I think this piece turned out so cute, and I really haven't seen anything else like this out in stores. And it is the perfect spring and summer decor piece for any tiered tray. Now for DIY number 3. For this one, I'm using this rolling pin hanger that I picked up from Dollar General. It's really cute on its own, but I wanted to make it go a little bit better with my decor. So I'm first starting by cutting off the jute hanger that was on this piece. I am not going to be using it as a hanger. And then I painted the front of the rolling pin with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I did have to do 3 coats of this paint to get all of the words and that design covered up, and I left the handles of the rolling pin that stained color. Then I'm taking this black and white buffalo check ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm tying it around the left handle of my rolling pin, and I'm creating a really simple bow, and then I'm cutting the tail ends of that ribbon on an angle. For this project, I'm also using this unfinished blessed word, and this came in a pack of unfinished wood words, and I picked them up from Hobby Lobby. I'm painting mine with the rich black colored paint from Folk Art, and I just did 1 quick coat. And then placing some hot glue on the back side of my word, and then I'm putting that right in the center of my rolling pin. Next, I'm using some hot glue to attach 4 of these towering game blocks from Dollar Tree. I want my sign to stand up, so this is just creating a stand to go on the back of my sign. Once I have all 4 of them glued together, I'm then placing some hot glue on the back of those blocks and then attaching them to the back of my rolling pin to create my stand. And this is my rolling pin sign all finished. It was really cute before I transformed it, but now it goes perfect with the home decor that I currently have in my kitchen. And now for DIY number 4. For this project, I'm using a 24 by 5.5 inch piece of wood. This piece of wood I'd already painted black for a project, and then I ended up not doing that project. So here I'm just repainting it with my Castle colored chalk paint from Folk Art, and I only did 1 quick coat of this paint. Once this paint was all dry, I then took my Waverly paint in the color Plaster, and I very lightly dry brushed this color over top of the Castle color for a distressed look. Then I'm using 3 of these wall pocket hangers. These are from Dollar Tree, and I'm using 3 of these words, Plant, Grow, Bloom, that I made on my Cricut machine. But if you don't have a Cricut, you can always use a Dollar Tree's letter stickers to create the words. Now I'm transferring all 3 of my Plant, Grow, Bloom words onto my planners. If you don't have the vinyl or a Cricut machine to be able to cut your words out, you can always use the stickers from Dollar Tree. Those are always another great option. Next, I'm placing my planners on my piece of wood and just spacing them out exactly where I want them to be before I start attaching them. To attach them, I am using hot glue. I'm just picking them up, placing the hot glue on the back of them, and then pressing them back onto the wood. They do have a hole if you wanted to use like a nail or a screw, but I just used hot glue. They are not real heavy, and I'm not going to be using real plants in these, so I wasn't too worried about just using the hot glue. The plants I'm going to be using in them are these 3 succulents from Dollar Tree. At first I started placing the Spanish moss in the planters first, but then realized it was better to put the succulent inside the planter and then place the Spanish moss all the way around the succulent afterward. So that's what I continued to do for all 3 of my pots. To add a little bit more detail to the bottom and the top of this piece, I'm using 4 strands of nautical rope. I'm using 2 of them on the top and 2 of them on the bottom. To attach them, I'm using hot glue just right on the wood and then placing the rope over top of it. Originally, I was going to have the rope wrapped around the piece of wood, but then decided I was just going to have them blunt cut on the 2 sides of my board. I then did the same thing for my remaining 2 pieces of rope on the top of my board. And here is my piece all finished. I really love how this one turned out. It was super easy to do, hardly took me any time at all to create it, and this would be a perfect wall piece if you placed a hanger on the back of it, but for the sake of the video, I just have it placed on the table. Now moving into DIY number 5. For this project, I'm using one of these unfinished wood recipe holders from Joann Fabrics. This was $3.99, but anytime I buy something from Joann's, I always use a coupon or buy it when it's on sale. I took out the jute hanger that was around the top, and then I started staining this entire piece with my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown, and I used an old towel to apply the stain. I have not been able to find the Craft Smart stain at Michael's for some time now, so I don't think that they make it anymore, which is a bummer because it's my favorite. So if you guys know of a really good water-based stain, I would love to know what it is, so you can leave me a comment in the comments down below letting me know what your favorites are. Once this entire piece was all stained and dry, I then used some sandpaper to distress around all of the edges of the piece and then a little bit on the front of it as well. Next, I'm using this Farm Fresh stencil that came in a pack of stencils from Michael's. I believe it is the Folk Art brand, and I will try to have it linked down in the description box below. I'm placing the stencil in the top center of my recipe holder, and then I'm using some painter's tape around all 4 sides of this stencil so that I don't get any paint on my wood that I've already stained. For the paint, I'm using my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and to apply it, I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush. Once the paint has dried, I'm then removing all of the painter's tape and the stencil. I'm also going to be using this little chicken that came on this piece that I picked up from Walmart. I believe it was back in the fall. I basically just bought this piece because I wanted to have the little farmhouse animals. So it had a hole in it and I needed to fill the hole, so I used some of my wood filler to fill that in, and then once it was all dry, I used my sandpaper to sand it down smooth. I then painted it with my Waverly paint in the color Plaster with a 1 quick coat, and then once that was dry, I took a piece of cotton cord. This is from Hobby Lobby, and I strung it through the hole that was already pre-drilled into this piece, and then I just made a knot and cut the ends of that off. And then for the very last step, I used some hot glue on the back side of my chicken and glued that underneath the words Farm Fresh. Here is the mini recipe holder all finished. It was a super simple project and it's perfect for any farmhouse kitchen, and because of the size, this one is also perfect for a tiered tray. And now for DIY number 6. I'm using this framed thankful sign that I picked up from Dollar Tree, and I first started by removing the piece of cardboard with the thankful word on it from the frame. And then I started painting my frame with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did 1 coat of this paint. I then set that aside to dry, and I'm using 4 of these little mini unfinished wood flower pots. These did come from Hobby Lobby, and they did come in a pack all together, and I did paint those with that same Waverly paint in the color Plaster. For the cardboard backing that was originally in the frame, I glued some of this striped cardstock onto the cardboard and then ended up not really liking it. So instead, I'm using some of this striped fabric that's also from Hobby Lobby, and I just laid out my cardboard on top of my fabric and then cut out around it for the size that I need. I did leave a lot of extra fabric around all 4 sides so that I'm able to fold the fabric over along the back side of the cardboard. Then to attach my fabric to my cardboard, I'm placing hot glue right on the cardboard and then folding that fabric over top onto the glue, and I continue that step for all 4 sides. Now that I have all of my fabric attached to my cardboard piece, I can then place that back into my frame and secure it. Then it's time to attach all 4 of my painted flower pots, but first I just space them out onto the front of my fabric exactly where I want them to be so I know where to glue them. And then I'm using hot glue on the back side of each one of my flower pots, and then I'm just placing those back into their place. Next, I'm adding some Spanish moss to all 4 of my flower pots. I'm placing hot glue right inside of the pot and then pressing the moss over top of that. And I did trim down the moss a little bit with some scissors so that it didn't look so messy. Then I'm using some of these cute little white flowers from Hobby Lobby. I cut them off of their stems and I'm using 1 flower per pot. And to attach them inside of the pots, I'm using a little bit of hot glue on the stem and then just pressing them down into the Spanish moss. For this next step, you'll see I did have to take the cardboard backing part back out of its frame. Next, I'm taking a piece of jute and I'm wrapping it around the top of my flower pot, right underneath the lip that's on the pot. And I'm taking the jute and wrapping it around to the back side of the flower pot and hot gluing that down. Once the glue has set, I'm then taking the pieces of jute and I'm twisting them together. And then once I have them all twisted, I'm taking the jute and wrapping it around the top of the cardboard piece and hot gluing that down to secure it. If I would have done this step before I glued my pots down, it would have made it a lot easier, but I did not know that I was going to be doing this in the beginning of the project. I was just kind of going with the flow when I started, so it would be easier to do this step before gluing your pots onto the fabric. So if you're going to do this, just remember to do that first. I did continue to do that for all 4 of my flower pots. Once I had them all attached with the jute, I then placed my backing back into the frame. And here are my framed flower pots all finished. This project turned out a lot different than what I had originally planned, but I really love how everything turned out. And this is perfect for any tabletop decor for spring or summer. For DIY number 7, this project is super easy. I'm using one of these glass jars that I picked up from Dollar Tree, and I'm first starting out by removing the lid from the jar, and then I'm painting that lid with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black. I only did 1 coat of this paint on the entire jar lid. For this project, I'm also using some of this black sand from Dollar Tree, and I'm pouring about 1 inch or so of sand on the very bottom of the jar. Then I'm using some rocks from Dollar Tree. I'm using these natural rocks and I'm placing those in the bottom of the jar. And I'm also going to be using some of the white stones that you can pick up from Dollar Tree. I thought it would be really pretty to just add a little bit of this white color along with those natural stones. So once I have those all placed in the bottom, I'm using one of these really cute succulents, also from Dollar Tree. I'm placing a hot glue on the very bottom stem of the succulent, and then I'm pressing that down into the sand between the rocks. I'm then putting together my painted jar lid and then screwing that back onto my jar. I'm then taking a piece of jute and I'm wrapping it around the top of my jar twice before tying it in a knot and then cutting off the extra long ends. And here is my planted succulent jar. This project is by far the easiest in today's video, and I just love the simplicity of it, and it just looks so pretty here on my tiered tray. Now moving right along into DIY number 8. For this one, I'm using 4 of these unfinished wooden pallets from Dollar Tree, and I started by painting all 4 of them with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. And I did make sure to paint in between all of the wooden slats on all of the pallets because you will be able to see them, and I did a 1 coat of paint on them. Once the paint was all dry, I started attaching them together, and I'm gonna have them all going upwards, so the long sides are gonna face up, and I'm using hot glue just right on the sides and then pressing them all together to form a little box. Next, I need to create a bottom for my box, so I'm using 8 popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree. 6 of the popsicle sticks are going to be the bottom of my box, and then 2 of them are going to hold all of the other ones together. So I'm just taking the 2 that I'm going to be attaching all of them together with, and I'm cutting those down a little bit so that they can fit. And then I'm using hot glue on the popsicle sticks and then just pressing them down onto the 6 bottom ones to hold them all together. I'm then placing my box on top of the popsicle sticks just to get an idea of where I need to cut them off a little bit because they are a little bit too long. So to cut them down, I'm just using my scissors, and you do want to use a good sharp pair, or if you have some cutters that cut through wood, those would work probably better than scissors. So I just continued that for each side until it was completely the size that I needed for my bottom. Now it's time to attach that bottom that I just created onto my box. So I'm putting the hot glue around the sides of the box and then just pressing that bottom square that I created on the bottom. And then to make it match the rest of my piece, I'm just painting that with that same Waverly paint in the color Plaster so that it all matches. To add some detail around my box, I'm using some of this dark burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree. I'm wrapping it around the very center of my box, just cutting that down to size, and then I'm hot gluing it around my box. Then over top of that burlap ribbon, I'm attaching some of this black and white buffalo check ribbon that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. It is the perfect size to go right around that burlap ribbon, so I didn't have to cut down the sides at all. I just cut it down to size and then hot glued it over top of the burlap. To add one extra detail to the very front of my box, I'm cutting down 4 pieces of this jute and I'm creating a really simple bow. Once I have my bow created, I then hot glue it on the very front of my box over top of the buffalo check ribbon, which you won't see that clip because my camera stopped recording. And then for the very last step, I'm adding some of these eucalyptus stems that I picked up from Walmart. Here is my flower box all finished. This one definitely screams a farmhouse to me. It was super easy to create, and what I really love about this one is you can switch up the flowers for whatever season it is. Now moving right along into DIY number 9. For this one, I'm using 2 of these really pretty placemats that I just recently picked up from Dollar General. They have that nice striped farmhouse print that's very popular right now. I first started out by cutting the tags off of the back side of both of the placemats so that you won't be able to see those. And then I placed one of the placemats with the print side down, and then I started placing hot glue along one of the sides and then attaching the second placemat print side up. So I'm just basically hot gluing all of the sides together to create my throw pillow. You can sew if you wanted to. I am a terrible sewer, so I will not be sewing these together. Or you can even use like heat tape that's really great for fabric as well. So I did 3 of the sides together with the hot glue, and I did leave one of the sides open so that I can fill it. To fill the inside of my pillow, I'm using this original polyfill. I usually always have this on hand since I am a crafter. I'm just placing it inside of the pillow until I think it's stuffed just the right amount, and then I'm hot gluing that last side together. And this is what the throw pillow looks like all finished. The placemats were $2 a piece, and I already had the polyfill at home, so it only cost me $4 to create this really pretty farmhouse pillow. And now for the last DIY today. For this one, I'm using 3 pieces of scrap wood, and these ones are 25 by 3.5. And I started by painting them with the Waverly paint in the color Plaster. I did 1 coat of paint for all 3 pieces of wood. Once that paint was all dry, I then used my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Java on a chip brush, and I just very lightly painted that over all of the pieces of wood that I've painted. This is giving them kind of that like rustic, distressed farmhouse look that you guys know I love so much, and I'm always really big on distressing. If you guys have seen any of my videos, then you will know that. Next, I'm attaching all of my wood pieces together. I'm placing hot glue on the sides of the wood and then pressing them together. You could always use an E6000 glue if you wanted something a little bit stronger than the hot glue. Then to ensure that all of my wood stays together, I'm adding just a little bit of extra hold by adding these painter sticks on the back side, and I'm just hot gluing those on in a diagonal. Next, I'm using this Farm Fresh Flower Market stencil from Hobby Lobby. I've used this in the past. Obviously, it has paint all over it, but I've reused it now like 3 times and it's still going strong. I'm just placing that on the top center of my wood piece, and then I'm using some painter's tape to just make sure it's secure before I start painting. The paint color I'm using to stencil is the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black, and I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. Then once my paint has completely dried, I'm removing all of the painter's tape and my stencil. I'm also using this piece that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. This is the Woodpile brand and it was $4.49, and I'm just staining this piece with that Craftsmart wood stain that I love so much and can no longer find. So remember, let me know in the comments down below if you guys know of a better water-based stain that would be kind of similar to this one. But I'm just using an old towel to apply this, and I'm only doing like the back part of this and then around all of the top edges because I'm going to be adding some other things to the front of this in a little bit, and I didn't need to stain that part. Now I'm adding some of these wood pieces to the very front of my piece. I did pick these up at Hobby Lobby, and they were like part of the Christmas and holiday stuff that they had out this past year, and I got them on clearance after Christmas. I'm just measuring how long they need to be to go on the front of my piece, and then I did end up cutting them in half just so that I could glue them onto the front a little bit better. And I just hot glued them on, placed the hot glue right on the backing and stuck it to the front. Then I thought it would be really cute to add some Spanish moss on the front of this piece, so I'm using some hot glue to attach the moss in between all of the logs. I'm then using some hot glue on the back side of this piece to attach it to my wood piece underneath the words that I just stenciled on. It does have a spot where you could use a nail if you wanted to do that as well. Then I added some of these really pretty yellow flowers from Hobby Lobby. I cut them down a little bit and then placed the stems inside of my planter. And I also used some of these other really greenery pieces that are also from Hobby Lobby. I cut the stems down on those and then just added them in between my yellow flowers. Then I'm adding one more little detail to this piece. I did leave a little space between the logs and the top of my wood piece so that I could add this rope. This white rope is from Dollar Tree. I cut it down to fit on top of my piece and then I just hot glued it on. And then I also have a little bit of a gap on the bottom of the logs as well, and I did the same thing, just cut the white rope down to size and then hot glued that underneath the logs. And this is my wood piece all finished. I love how this one turned out. You could use a wall hanger on the back of it if you wanted to hang it on the wall, or just set it on a table like I do here. For the first DIY today, I'm using this scrap piece of wood, and it is 7 inches by 1.5 inches. And I first started by painting it with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I did 1 coat of this paint, and once it was dry, I then used my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle on a Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I very lightly dry brushed this color over top of the plaster color to give this piece a rustic, distressed look. Next, I'm using this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting it down so that it will fit on the front of my wood. I had to cut it down on both sides, and then also I made it a little bit thinner, and then I frayed out all of the edges of the burlap ribbon. Then it was time to attach the ribbon to my wood, and I used a little bit of hot glue on both ends of the ribbon to secure them into place. In this project, I'm also using these Scrabble letters. These ones came from Dollar General, and I'm spelling out the word Farmhouse. Once I have it all centered in place, I then started to hot glue each letter back down. Next, I'm creating my legs that go on this wood piece, and for that, I'm using these little finial caps from Hobby Lobby. This, I'm only going to show you how I make one leg, but I used a smaller finial and then one that's a little bit larger than that, and I hot glued the 2 tops of those together, and then once I have one of the legs formed, I then hot glued that leg onto the bottom of my wood piece, and I did that obviously for 2 legs. And then here, I'm just painting the legs, and that is with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I did 1 coat of paint for each leg. Then once those were all dry, I wanted them to have a little bit of a distressed look, so I took my plaster colored paint on a small paintbrush, and I just really lightly painted this color just randomly over the legs so that they kind of matched the rest of the piece and had a nice distressed rustic look. Here is my farmhouse sign all finished. This one was really easy to create, and what I love about this one is it's a little different than anything that I've seen. Now moving right on into DIY number 2. For this one, I'm using 2 unfinished wood corbels that I picked up from Lowe's. They are 7 inches and I paid $5.68 for each one. And what's nice about these is they have the hooks already on the back, even though I'm not going to be using them today. I first started by painting each corbel with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I only did 1 coat of paint for each corbel. Once they were all dry, I am going to be trying to create a really chippy look to them. So I'm taking an old candle and I'm rubbing the wax from the candle all over the corbel where I want to have my paint chipped. So like I said, I want to have these really distressed and chippy, and this is going to give me the look that I want. Once I had the wax all rubbed on over top of that plaster paint, I then started painting my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I did 2 coats of that over top of the wax, and again for both corbels. After that Castle color dried, I'm then using some packing tape and I'm placing it over top of my corbel, and I am going to be working in sections, so right now I'm just taking 1 piece of tape over top of an area, and then I pressed it really well on the corbel and peeled it back. And as you can see, it's giving me this really nice chippy effect. I normally use duct tape when I'm doing this method, but I did not have any, so I'm using this packing tape, and it's actually working really great. So as you can see here, I'm just working in different areas with different strips of tape, and you can use the tape like 1 or 2 times before you have to get a new piece of tape. And I did this over top of both of my corbels until I got the nice chippy look that I wanted. Then for all of the areas that I couldn't really reach with the wax, I just took a piece of sandpaper and sanded the Castle color off and just dressed it a little bit that way. And here are my corbels all finished. I chose to just leave mine as an accent decor piece, which I've seen on a lot of magazines and stores, but if you wanted to hang them, you could, because they do have a hanger on the back. I was able to create mine for just about $11. The third DIY for today, I'm going to be creating a picture frame, and I'm using this little sign from Dollar Tree, and I'm starting by just ripping off the little metal part that's on the front, and I am going to be using this, so I'm just going to be setting it aside for now. Then I took my drill and I drilled a hole in the very top of the sign. The front of this piece had a little sign on it, and I tried to use my hairdryer to get it heated up and peel it off, but it did not work, so I ended up having to use some 60 grit sandpaper to sand that off. Once it was all sanded off, I then used my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I painted this entire piece with that color, and I did 2 different coats of paint. Just like the last project I did, I wanted this piece to have a really chippy look, so I'm using that same candle and I'm rubbing the wax all over this entire piece to give me that chippy effect that I would like to have. After the wax was all on, I then painted my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster over top, and I only did 1 coat of this paint. After the paint was all dry, I then started using my tape and I just pressed it on and then peeled it back to chip off all of that top layer of paint. For this project, I'm also using this mini wooden candlestick holder and then wooden finial. These both came from Hobby Lobby, and I'm painting them both with that Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did 1 coat of paint for each piece. And I'm also using one of these 3-inch wooden discs. This is from either Lowe's or Home Depot, but I know that they also carry these at craft stores like Michael's and Hobby Lobby, and I'm just painting this one with that same plaster color paint. After the plaster color was all dry, I wanted to add a little bit of distressing to these, so I used the Castle colored paint, and I very lightly painted this around all of those top grooves on the finial, also on the candlestick, and then the 3-inch disc. I also decided to add these 2 wooden caps. These are from Hobby Lobby and they come in a pack with a bunch of them in there, and I painted these with that same plaster colored paint. Now it's time to start putting everything together. I'm placing that finial in the hole that I drilled in the very top of my wood piece, and then I'm using a little bit of hot glue at the bottom of it before I start pressing it all the way down, just so it's a little bit more secure. And then I placed hot glue on the bottom of the candlestick and placed that on top of my wood disc. Then I took that metal piece that I took off in the beginning and I'm reattaching it using some small nails that I had laying around, and I'm just nailing those in with my hammer. And then I'm also hot gluing the wood caps that I painted with the plaster color over top of those nails. I then wanted those to have a little bit of that distressing on them, so I just painted some of that castle color right over top of them. For the last step, I needed to attach my candlestick to the top of my wood piece, so I just placed some hot glue on the top of the candlestick and centered it on my wood piece. Here is my picture frame all finished. I placed my son's picture in there and I think it turned out so cute. I love the size of this, and the chippy look really goes with my decor. Now moving right along into DIY number 4. For this one, I'm going to be using some of these wood beads that I just recently picked up from Hobby Lobby. This was a part of the crafting supplies that they're already putting out for Christmas. Can you believe it? So anyway, I'm using these beads, and then I wanted to use a stain, but I didn't really have a gray stain, so I'm using my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I mixed some water with it. And then I placed my beads right in the mixture and just rolled them around. I did end up having to add a little bit of water because my paint was still a little bit thick. And then I just kept adding the beads until I got them all stained for the amount of beads that I wanted to use. Once I had them all mixed up well, I then laid them out on a towel, but I wanted them to have kind of like a distressed look to them, so I took my towel and I wiped some of that paint stain off of them so that I did have some of that natural wood coming through on the beads. Next, I'm creating my tassels to go on my bead garland, and for this I'm using some jute, and I decided to wrap my jute around this small book that I had. I needed something to wrap my jute around, and I was going to do my hands, but my hands are pretty small and my tassels wouldn't have been long enough, so I ended up just using this book, but you can really use anything that you want just to hold your jute in place while you're wrapping it. And I did mine about 20 to 25 times around the book, and then once I was all done, I just pulled the jute off of the book, and it looks like this here. And then I took another piece of jute and I'm just tying that in a knot around the very top of my little roll or strings of jute that I have here. I'm then leaving those two ends of that piece of jute that I just tied around upward, and then I'm gathering the rest of them at the bottom and cutting them. I'm then flipping those the opposite direction, and then I'm going to be cutting them just so that they are a little bit shorter but also all even. I'm then holding that piece and I'm holding it about an inch down from the very top, and you can see that there's a little loop here. And then I'm taking another piece of jute and I'm wrapping it around about an inch down. As you can see, the loop and the hole is still there. I did it about 10 times and then I tied a knot with my jute, and then I cut those two little ends of the jute off. Next, I'm taking another piece of jute, and this is going to be the one that I string all of my beads on, and I'm placing the end of that jute through the hole that's in the top of my tassel, and I'm tying that in a knot, and I'm leaving one side of the jute about a couple inches long, and I'm leaving that on. I'm not cutting that off. Then my really long piece, I'm now stringing all of my beads on. I started with this gray color, and then I took this natural color bead that's just a little bit smaller than the gray one and strung that on. Then I did another gray one, and I just kept alternating between the two color beads and the two different sizes until I got as many beads as I wanted to use strung on my jute. When I got to the very end and I had all of my beads strung on, I then was ready to attach my second tassel, and then I took the end of that jute that I had all of my beads strung on and I put it through the loop or through that hole on my second tassel, and then I tied it as close as I could to the very last bead in a knot. I then cut my jute, but I left about an inch of it out, and then I strung that piece up through the bottom bead, and I did the same thing with the leftover jute on the other side. And this is what my bead jute garland or bead garland looks like. I think it turned out really cute, and I really love the colors with my decor, and you can really switch it up and choose whatever color or stain to go with your decor. And now for the fifth DIY today. For this one, I'm using this pack of wood disc from Hobby Lobby. It's from the Woodpile brand, and it comes in a pack of 4, and I'm using all 4 of them today. I'm painting all of them with my Waverly paint in the color Plaster. I'm also using this pack of stencils from Dollar Tree, and I needed to have them all separate, so I just used my scissors and cut them all so that they are separate. I'm taking one of my stencils, this Be Brave one is the first one I'm doing, and I'm placing it in the center of my disc that I painted, and then I'm using painter's tape around all four sides to hold it into place. But I want my wreath and my words to be a different color, so I'm first putting some painter's tape over the words so I don't accidentally paint those a different color. And then I'm using my folk art paint in the color Sage Shadow on a Dollar Tree stencil brush to stencil that paint on. Then once it's dry, I'm removing the painter's tape from my words in the middle, and then I'm placing painter's tape over top of the wreath that I just painted on so that I don't get any of the paint that I'm painting the words on my painted wreath. For the words, I'm using my same Dollar Tree stencil brush, only this time I'm using my Castle colored paint. Once that paint was dry, I then removed the painter's tape from my entire piece. I continued those same steps with the other 3 discs and the other 3 stencils, and then for each one I wanted to add a little bit of distressing, so I used my Castle Color chalk paint on a small paintbrush and I painted that around the edges of all of my circles and then a little bit on the front. I'm also using these magnetic buttons from Dollar Tree, and these are going to be magnets. So I am just going to be placing a little bit of hot glue on the back side of each one of my discs and then adding 2 magnets to the back of each one. I thought that this was a really cute idea to just add a little bit of a farmhouse cuteness to my refrigerator. I am just showing you what they look like finished here on my table. I actually couldn't film them on my refrigerator because it's stainless steel and the reflection was just really bad on camera. But this is what they look like and they turned out really cute. Now moving into DIY number 6, for this one today I'm using some different pieces of scrap wood. These are all from Hobby Lobby. 4 of them are 7 inches by 1.5, and then 2 of them are 7.5 inches by 1.5. For the 2 longer pieces that are 7.5 by 1.5 inches, I'm painting those with that Castle Color chalk paint. I did 1 coat of paint on both longer pieces of wood. Then for all of the pieces of wood that are 7 inches by 1.5 inch, I painted those with the Plaster Color chalk paint from Waverly, and I just did 1 coat of paint. Once all of the paint was dry on all of the plaster colored ones, I dry brushed the Castle Color over top of them to give them a distressed look. Once I had them all painted and distressed, I started hot gluing all of my plaster color pieces of wood together. I just placed the hot glue on the side of one of the pieces of wood, and then I just pressed another one together until they were all glued together. Then for my bottom piece, I just hot glued that on as well. I placed hot glue in the center of the piece of wood and then placed my 5 white ones on top, and then I realized I probably should not add my top piece on just yet until I use my stencil. This stencil came from a pack of stencils from Joann Fabrics, but I think they have it on Amazon, and I'll try to have it linked down below. But I'm only going to be using the words that were in that stencil, so I just cut them out so that they could fit onto all of my pieces of wood nicely. And then I used some of my painter's tape around all 4 sides to hold my stencil into place. The color I'm using for my stencil is from Folk Art, and it's the color Rich Black, and I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. Once the paint was all dry, I then removed my stencil and all of the painter's tape. Then I added my last piece of wood. I hot glued it to the very top of the plastered colored pieces, and then I wanted to add some detail to this piece, so I'm stringing a bead onto a piece of jute, and I tied 2 knots to hold the bead on the piece of jute, and it's just a very small natural colored bead. And then I'm using one of these larger beads that I stained earlier in the video, and then another smaller wooden bead, and I'm just tying a double knot to hold all of the beads into place. And then I'm just taking those beads and stringing them so that they're on the front of my sign at the very top of all of my words. And I tied it in the back because my jute was long enough to do that. And then I just hot glued it to hold my jute into place. And here is my Happiness is Homemade sign all finished. It was really easy to do, and I think it turned out super cute. For the first DIY today, I'm going to be making over one of these little house signs from Dollar General, and this one was only $1. It's really cute on its own, but I just wanted to give it a little bit of a makeover. I was originally going to take the tin roof part off, but I decided to leave that on. And for the front of the house, I'm painting that with my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I did 2 coats of this paint to get everything on the front all covered up. I'm also using this wood square block that I got from Michael's, and I believe this was only like $1 or $1.50, and I want my house to stand up, so by using this block and attaching the house to it, it's gonna help it stand up. And it's a little bit larger than my house shape as well, so it's gonna give me a little bit of a border around the house. I'm painting my wood block with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did 1 coat of paint on the entire wood square. After that paint was all dry, I'm then putting hot glue on the back side of my house and gluing that right in the center of my painted square. Next, I'm using one of these unfinished wood circles, and this one is also from Michael's. I was gonna take the tag off and then figured, oh, you're not gonna see it anyway, so I ended up leaving that on. But I am giving this circle a quick coat of that Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. After the paint is all dry, I'm then going to be applying this Bless Our Nest stencil. This is the perfect size for my circle, and I've actually used this stencil a few times already and it's still going strong. So I'm just placing my stencil in the center of my circle, and then for the stencil color that I'm going to be painting on, it is that same folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I just use my Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. And this stencil is from Michael's. It came in a pack of stencils, and I will try to have those linked down below. Once the paint is all dry, I'm then removing the stencil. Next, I'm using some of this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree. I'm cutting it down to size so that it will fit going across the center of my house, and then I'm using hot glue on each side of the ribbon to attach it to the front of the house. And then I'm also attaching my circle with the Bless Our Nest stenciled on it right in the center of that burlap ribbon. Then to add a little bit more detail to my roof, I'm using that plastered colored chalk paint, and I'm very lightly painting that over top of my tin roof. And then for the last step, I'm using some of this striped ribbon from Dollar Tree. I'm making a really simple bow, and then I'm using some hot glue on the back side of the bow to attach that right above my Bless Our Nest circle. And here is my Bless Our Nest house all finished. It goes perfect with the decor that I have currently in my home, and it was super easy to create. Now moving right on into DIY number 2. For this one, I'm using this wood round. I picked this one up from Goodwill for $1.99, but they have similar things like this at Lowe's and Home Depot. And I'm also using 4 of these unfinished wood legs. These ones I did pick up from Lowe's, and they were $1.98 a piece. I'm starting by painting my entire round circle with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I did 2 coats of paint on the entire thing, the front, the back, and all of the sides. Then once the paint was all dry, I took a piece of sandpaper and I started sanding around all of the edges. And then I also took that same piece of sandpaper and sanded in random spots on the front to give my piece a worn, distressed look. And I used that same plaster color to paint over all 4 of my wood legs, and I only did 1 coat of paint for these. Then once the paint was all dry, I then took my sandpaper once again and sanded on all 4 of the legs to give them a distressed look, just like my other pieces in today's project. Now that I have everything all painted and distressed, it's time to start deciding where I'm going to be placing my legs. I just took the legs and eyeballed them where I thought that they should go, and then I pressed the little metal screws on the back of the legs into my wood, and it left a mark. So then it left a mark obviously where I need to drill. There is probably a better way to do this, and actually measuring is probably best, but honestly I did not do that. I just kind of eyeballed it and placed them where I thought they needed to go, and then used my drill to drill holes in the places that were marked. I then screwed each one of my legs in the holes that I drilled. I am going to be taking the legs back out. I just screwed them in just to make sure that they were going to go in okay before I start adding my glue and things like that. And I did that for all 4 of the legs. As you can see, the legs are back out, and now I'm going to be adding this stencil. This stencil is from Hobby Lobby. I believe it was only like $2.49, and you can reuse it if you take really good care of it. I just placed the stencil in the center of my circle, and then I'm using painter's tape to hold it into place. I'm then using my folk art chalk paint in the color Rich Black on a Dollar Tree stencil brush to stencil the color on this entire stencil. And when I'm stenciling, I always place a little bit of paint on my brush and then build it up so that I don't have any bleed through underneath the stencil. You can also use Mod Podge before stenciling to help with the bleeding as well. Once the paint was all dry, I then removed my painter's tape and my stencil. Now I'm getting back to the legs. I'm placing hot glue around the screws, and then I'm screwing them right into the holes that I've already drilled. You could always use E6000 if you weren't comfortable using only hot glue, but the hot glue seemed to work just fine for me, and I continued that for all 4 of the legs. And here is my decorative stool all finished. I think it turned out really cute, and it honestly could not have been any easier. Now for the third DIY today, I'm using one of these pen or pencil holders from Dollar Tree, and I'm also using some of these pearl sticker dots from Dollar Tree. And I'm starting by taking a strip of the pearl dots, and then I'm placing those around the top edge of my pencil holder, and I'm continuing to go all the way around the top edge until it's completely covered. And I did have to cut off 1 or 2 of the pearls just to keep the pattern going the same. And then I also did that for the bottom edge of the pen and pencil holder as well. After I have all of my pearl dots on, I'm then painting over my entire vase and over all of the dots with my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I did 2 coats of this paint. Then once that paint was all dry, I took my plastered colored paint on a Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I just dry brushed that color over top of my entire piece, just kind of randomly in places where I thought that it needed some of that white color. And where all of the dots are, where I'm painting this plaster color over top, it's really making those areas pop. Next, I'm taking some Spanish moss from Dollar Tree and I'm placing it inside of my holder, and then I'm using some of these lamb's ear stems from Walmart and I'm placing those right down inside of that Spanish moss. And then I'm also using some of these baby's breath stems also from Walmart, and I'm placing those around the lamb's ear. And this is my decorative vase all finished. This was super easy and another project that you can really customize to fit with your own home decor. And now moving right along to the 4th and final DIY for today. I'm using these 3-inch terracotta saucers and these wooden mini candlesticks. These all I got from Hobby Lobby, but you can get the terracotta saucers at pretty much any store. I know Walmart even sells these. And I'm starting by painting the saucers with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I only had to do 1 coat of this paint on both of my saucers. I'm also painting my mini wooden candlesticks with that same plaster colored chalk paint, and again only had to do 1 coat of paint on both of them. Once the paint was all dry, I'm then using some sandpaper to sand around all of the edges on my saucer to give it a distressed look and have that terracotta color pop back through. And once I did that to the saucers, I moved on and did the same thing to both of my candlesticks. I just distressed them a little bit with the sandpaper. Then it was time to start assembling everything together. I placed hot glue on the bottom of one of my candlesticks and then placed that in the center of the bottom of one of my saucers. I placed hot glue on the top of my second candlestick and then placed that on the top of the first candlestick. And then for the second saucer, I just placed the hot glue right on the bottom of the candlestick, and then I flipped that over on top of my saucer. I found that this was a little bit easier for me to get it centered. And then for the finishing touches, I thought it would be really cute to add some Spanish moss to the top saucer. And then I ended up using some greenery that I had laying around, which I think this one is from Hobby Lobby. These were just some extra pieces that I had in my craft stash, and I made them go around the top of the saucer, kind of like a wreath. And then I placed a bird that I have had for a while from the Target dollar spot right in the center of the greenery. And this is my candlestick or candle holder all finished, even though I'm not using a candle in it. I think it turned out really cute, and you can use different size terracotta pots and different size of those little wooden rounds to make even larger ones if you wanted to. The materials I used today were two 6.5 by 3.5 by 1/4 inch thick pieces of wood. I also used one 24 by 5.5 by 3/8 inch thick piece of wood, and then two 24 by 3.5 by 1/4 inch thick pieces of wood. Folk art chalk paint in Persian gray, Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, folk art wood tint in gray, paintbrushes, handles that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, a hammer and nails, a screwdriver, and my hot glue gun. I first started out by painting all of my pieces of wood with my folk art chalk paint in the color Persian gray. I did do 2 different coats of paint on each piece of wood so that I had a nice base coat. Once that paint was all dry, I then went in with my folk art wood tint in the color gray, and I used a paper towel just to apply the stain, and I just randomly put it all over the pieces of wood so that it would have a really nice, like, distressed look to it. I would recommend using a towel to apply this wood tint instead of a paper towel, because some of the paper towel like bunched up a little bit on the wood, but it wasn't really a big deal. Once I had the wood stain on and it completely dried, I then went in with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster on a chip brush, and I dry brushed this color over all of my pieces of wood. This is just adding another layer of dimension and distressing the wood a little bit more. Next, I'm setting up all of my wood exactly how I want it to be before I start attaching all of the pieces together. Once I have my layout all figured out, I'm then placing some hot glue on the side of what's going to be my bottom piece of wood. That's the 24 by 5.5 by 3/8 inch thick piece of wood. And very quickly before the hot glue dries, I'm then just attaching one of my side pieces, and that one is the 24 by 3.5 by 1/4 inch piece of wood. I'm then continuing that same step for the other side, placing hot glue along the bottom piece of wood and then attaching my other long side piece the exact same way. And then again, for the 2 sides of my box, I'm doing the same thing, just placing the hot glue around the edges, and then I'm attaching each side piece, and those were the 6.5 by 3.5 by 1/4 inch thick pieces of wood. To ensure that my box stays together, I'm using some nails and just hammering those in around each side of my box. Obviously, the hot glue wasn't going to hold everything together. I just used that to keep my pieces of wood held together until I could get the nails in. I do this on a lot of my projects. If you guys have seen any of my other videos, you'll see I did the same thing in a lot of those tutorials as well. If you guys wanted to use a wood glue or an industrial glue, that would work just as well, and you could even use clamps to hold all of your wood together. As you can see here, I'm just continuing to nail in all of my nails around all of the sides of my box. If you wanted to, you could even do this step before painting or staining your wood as well. Now I'm taking both of my handles and I'm centering them on each side of my box. I'm using a pen to mark exactly where the holes are on my handle so that when I drill the holes, they are exactly where I need them to be. Next, I'm taking my drill and I'm making holes in all of the spots that I've already pre-marked for my handles. I'm then screwing in the screws that came with the handle on the inside of my box. I screwed them just enough that I had some of the screws sticking on the outside of the box. I then placed my handle onto the screws and then finished screwing those screws in on the inside. To add just a little bit more detail, I'm using my folk art chalk paint in the color Rich Black, and I'm painting that on both of my handles and then adding some of it on my entire box. Now that I have my box all finished being painted and put together, I'm adding some boxwood and eucalyptus stems that I picked up from Walmart. I'm just randomly placing them in my box wherever I think really looks good. And then I'm also using some of these grapevine balls that I added, and I did 3 of them throughout the entire box, and then I just stuck some cotton stems and then some lamb's ears in between. And here is my farmhouse centerpiece box all finished. I love how this one turned out, and it was super easy to make. What I love about this is you can switch out the decor. You can either put candles or different florals in this box throughout the seasons. For the first DIY, I'm making a bakery wall sign, and for this project, I started out by painting 3 24-inch by 3.5-inch by 1/4 inch thick pieces of wood with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, and I did 2 coats of paint on all 3 pieces of wood. Once that plaster color was all dry, I then went in with my folk art chalk paint in the color Java and my Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I dry brushed that color around all of the edges of all 3 pieces of wood. Next, I'm using my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown to stain 2 pieces of wood that are 11.5 by 1.5 by 3/8 inch thick, and I only did 1 coat of the stain on both of these pieces of wood. While my stain was drying, I then moved on and started painting all of the letters that I'm going to be using on my sign. And the letters I'm using are spelling out the word bakery, and I picked these ones up from Michael's, and they are 5 inches. And the paint that I'm using is the folk art chalk paint in the color rich black, and I painted all of my letters just with 1 coat of that paint. After the paint was dry on the letters, I then went in with some sandpaper and sanded around all of the edges and a little bit on the front of each letter. Next, I'm taking all 3 pieces of wood that I've painted with my plaster color chalk paint, and I'm just lining them up so that I can have them all nice and straight before I start attaching everything together. To ensure that all 3 pieces of my plastered colored wood are going to stick together, I'm using a scrap piece of wood that I had in my stash, and I placed hot glue along the back side of that, and then just placed that on one side in the center of my 3 pieces of plastered colored wood, and then I did the same thing with another scrap piece of wood for the other side. Next, I'm taking some more hot glue and running it along the top edge of my sign. Once I have the glue all on, I'm then taking one of my stained 24-inch by 3.5-inch pieces of wood and just pressing that over top of the hot glue to attach it. Then for the side piece on my sign, I'm doing one of the 11.5 by 1.5-inch pieces of wood and then continuing those same steps for the other 2 sides of my sign. I like to use hot glue to attach all of my wood pieces together first before I go in and start nailing all of my wood together. This just helps the wood stay in place for when I'm nailing all of my nails in. For the sides of my sign, I used 3 nails going along each side. You could always use a wood glue if you'd like, or a stronger industrial glue, but I feel that the hot glue and the nails have worked just fine for me and other signs that I've made in the past. And for the smaller sides of my sign, I nailed in 3 nails as well. Now that I have the base of my sign all put together, I'm then taking my letters that spell out the word bakery, and I'm just setting them down on the front of my sign for how I want them to be when I start gluing them down. I then took hot glue, placed it along the back of each letter, and then just pressed the letter back into place to attach it to my sign. Here is the bakery sign all finished. This could be a great statement piece for your kitchen. It was super easy to make, and even better, it was really inexpensive as well. Now moving into DIY number 2, I'm making a farmhouse kitchen sign. For this one, I first started out by painting a 12.5 by 5.5 by 3/8 thick piece of wood with my folk art chalk paint in the color Persian gray. I did 2 different coats of paint on this piece of wood. Once the paint was completely dry, I then went in with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and a chip brush, and I dry brushed this color on my entire piece of wood. And I did use a good amount of paint on my chip brush. As you can see here, I wanted this piece of wood to look really rustic and have a lot of like worn paint on it, so that's why I'm using a little bit more paint than I normally would. After I had my wood piece all painted, I then moved on and started painting this spoon that I picked up from Dollar Tree. I wish I would have had some spray paint for this, but I just used what I had, and what I had was the Waverly paint in the color Plaster, so I just painted that on with a paintbrush, and I did have to do 3 different coats of paint to get it covered up really nicely. Once the paint was all dry on my spoon, I then took the stencil that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. It has a rooster, a cow, and a pig on it. I'm just using the rooster that's on the top part of this stencil. I placed it in the center of my spoon, and I'm using my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black on a Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I'm painting right over top of that rooster. And since I really couldn't tape the stencil down, I'm just holding it into place as I go along the stencil. After the rooster was all painted on, I then pulled off the stencil. I then placed my spoon and the bottom portion of my piece of wood right in the center, and then I used some hot glue on the wood to attach my spoon. Next, I'm using these stamps that I picked up from Michael's. I'm using all capital letters, and I'm stamping on the words Farmhouse Kitchen right above my spoon. Then I'm using some of this black and white buffalo check ribbon from Hobby Lobby. I'm cutting it down to size, and I'm having it wrapped around the front of my sign under the words Farmhouse Kitchen. I'm then hot gluing the 2 ends of the ribbon along the back side of my wood. For the last step, I'm taking some more of that rich black chalk paint on a very small paintbrush, and I'm painting that around all of the edges of my spoon. Here is my Farmhouse Kitchen sign all finished. I think it turned out super cute. My stamped letters that say Farmhouse Kitchen are not perfect, but I think it adds a little bit more of a rustic feel with them being a little imperfect. Now moving on for the last DIY today, I'm making a tiered tray. For this one, I started by spray painting these 2 pans that I picked up from Dollar Tree with my Rust-Oleum spray paint in the color Oil Rubbed Bronze. I did 2 coats of this paint on the front side of the pans and then also on the back side of the pans. After the Rust-Oleum paint was all dry, I then took my Waverly paint in the color Plaster on a chip brush, and I started dry brushing that over top of my entire pan. I focused most of the paint around all of the edges of the pan, and then I took whatever was left over on my brush and then just dry brushed that on the rest of the pan. I did those same steps on the back side of the pan, and then also the exact same steps on the second pan as well. Next, I'm using some of these unfinished candlesticks that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, and I'm just using some scissors to pop out the metal pieces that are on the top of the candlesticks. I then went in with my Waverly paint in the color Plaster, and I painted 2 coats of paint on both candlesticks. I also painted one of these mini wooden finials that came in a pack from Walmart, and I'm using that same Waverly paint in Plaster. Now it's time to assemble everything. I'm placing hot glue on the bottom of one of my candlesticks and then just placing it right in the center of my bottom pan, which is a little bit bigger than the top pan. I'm then placing more hot glue on the top of the candlestick and then placing my second pan on top of that, and I'm just making sure that it's centered before I place it down on top of my glue. I'm then using some more hot glue on the top of my second candlestick, and then I'm placing that in the center of my second pan. You definitely want to make sure that this is centered before pressing it down. I'm then taking some more glue, placing it on the bottom part of my finial, and then attaching that to the top of my second candlestick. You could leave the candlesticks just painted white, but I wanted to add a little bit more of a rustic feel to them, so I'm taking my rich black chalk paint from Folk Art on a really small paintbrush, and then I'm painting that color around all of the areas of the candlesticks that have grooves to them, and I think it added a really nice rustic feel to them, and I was really messy when painting this color on. I then took some more of my Waverly paint and Plaster on a chip brush, and I was just going to add a little bit of like distressing to the black that I painted around the candlesticks, but the paint wasn't all the way dry, so of course when I was painting the white over the black, it ended up making more of like a gray color. You can kind of see it here, and instead of stopping, I just decided to go with it. So I made kind of like a gray color with the white and the black and just distressed the rest of the candlesticks. Here is my tiered tray all finished. This is what it looks like without any of the decor that I decorated it with, and I think it looks really cute. If you wanted to use more of an industrial type glue, you could always use like an E6000 instead of the hot glue that I used. This is what it looks like with all of my decor that I placed on it, and I think it is so cute. And I don't know why I waited so long to make a tiered tray, but I'm so happy that I finally got around to doing it. For this project, I used 4 3.5 by 24-inch pieces of wood that I picked up from Lowe's, and I also used 2 3.5 by 12-inch pieces of wood. Waverly chalk paint in the color ink, plaster, and also in the color moss, folk art chalk paint in the color castle, paintbrushes, floral foam from Dollar Tree, scissors, greenery stems from Hobby Lobby, eucalyptus stems from Walmart, a hammer and also some nails, painter's tape, my hot glue gun, a decorative tin from Hobby Lobby, this Bless This Home stencil from Joann Fabrics, and 2 sawtooth hangers. For this project, I started by painting all of my pieces of wood with my chalk paint in the color plaster. I did do 2 different coats of this paint to make sure that I had a nice even base. Once that paint was completely dried, I then went in with my castle colored chalk paint and my Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I started dry brushing this color along all of the edges and flat surfaces of my pieces of wood. I love using these stencil brushes. They are perfect for dry brushing. I love the way that I added a really nice distressed look to all of my wood. Next, I'm laying down my 4 3.5 by 24-inch pieces of wood exactly how I want them to be before I start attaching everything together. Then I'm laying down my 2 3.5 by 12-inch pieces of wood on the back side of that. And then to attach everything together, I'm using some hot glue. I'm placing the hot glue right on the back side of those 2 3.5 by 12-inch pieces of wood, and then just pressing them down onto my longer pieces of wood to attach everything together. Then to make sure that everything stays sturdy and well put together, I'm adding 4 nails on each of my 3.5 by 12-inch pieces of wood. This again is just going to make sure that everything stays nice and sturdy and this piece lasts for a really long time. Now I'm laying down this Bless This Home stencil that I picked up from Joann Fabrics, and then using my measuring tape to make sure that it's centered before I start taping it down with my painter's tape. I'm using 4 pieces of painter's tape on all 4 sides of the stencil just to make sure that it doesn't move around once I start painting. For the words Bless This Home, I'm using my chalk paint in the color ink and my Dollar Tree stencil brush. I'm holding down the stencil as I go around each letter because I don't want to have any bleeding underneath, and I am using a little bit of paint at a time. If I have to go over the words more than once, this is way better than using too much paint and having bleeding underneath. Then for all of my greenery around the stencil, I'm using my chalk paint in the color moss and my Dollar Tree stencil brush once again, and I'm just continuing those same steps as I did for the words Bless This Home. Once I have everything all painted on and the paint has dried, I'm then peeling off the painter's tape and removing the stencil from my wood. Next, I'm taking my scissors and this floral foam from Dollar Tree, and I'm just cutting it down so that it is the correct size to fit right into the decorative tin that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. Then I'm taking my greenery stems and my eucalyptus stems, and I'm placing them into the floral foam until I have my tin all filled up. I'm hammering in a nail on the front of my piece under the words Bless This Home so I can hang my tin with my floral arrangement. You could leave your piece just like this if you're not going to be hanging it from the wall, but I plan to hang mine from the wall, so I'm adding 2 sawtooth hangers to the very back of mine. And when you're doing this, you just want to make sure that you have both of them centered so that they sit straight on the wall. Here is my Bless This Home decorative wall piece all finished. I love how it turned out. It was actually really easy to do, and it was way cheaper for me to make than to buy a similar piece that's already done in store. And that wraps it up for all 25 of today's projects. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing. Please be sure to hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. And I want to thank all of you so much for watching.